class, chapter 20. We're going to be talking about the gram-negative bacilli today. And so these pathogens include things like Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Bordetella pertussis, which causes the whooping cough. Another good old favorite is E. coli. Everyone loves E. coli. Then we'll look at Salmonella and Shigella, and then finally finish up with one of them that causes the plague. And it's kind of one of my favorite because I used to do research when I was a postdoctorate grad at the University of Kentucky working on the bacteria that causes the plague, which is Yersinia pestis. And so there's a couple of different forms of that. We'll talk a little bit about what plague is and how that affects, but it's kind of near and dear to my heart because I did do some research on that back in the day, a while back. And I published a couple papers on that too. So if you're interested, you can always go back and look a little bit on history and see there's some of my publications there. So why don't we begin today's talk looking at the gram-negative bacilli and kind of work our way through and talk about some of the wonderful, interesting things. And today I've got some really good pictures to show you guys with Pseudomonas and E. coli and Shigella and Salmonella and all that. So we got lots of fun things to talk about today. All right, so let's begin. So the first thing, obviously, we're going to do is look at the major groups of the gram-negative bacillus bacteria. So last time in chapter 19, we talked about the gram-positives. This time, we're going to look at the gram-negatives. And again, we can break these groups into three different types of species. We have, well, actually four if we kind of think about it. The first one are the aerobic bacilli, and we kind of put them outside of most of the group because today you're going to find most of the bacteria are ones that we think of in the intestine or the enterics. The first group are kind of these free-living bacteria that we tend to find in water, soil, and in the air, sometimes amoebas and other things in that. And so we call these the aerobic because they have to use oxygen. They're obligate aerobes, and they have to use oxygen in order to survive. Then we're going to look at the enteric pathogens, and these include the lactose fermenters, which are E. coli, Klebsiella, Citrobacter. Those are all lactose positive bacteria. And then finally, we'll look at the non-lactose fermenters, which include ones that are Salmonella and Shigella. And they're called the enterics because we find them in the intestines of warm-blooded mammals. And so most of them in the lactose fermenters are found in humans. The ones that are non-lactose fermenters, they're primarily found in other species, but we do have to worry about them because they are found in other animals. And when we mix and cross-contaminate in our kitchen, we can get these things and can cause infections that way. Then the last group we're going to look at is the non-enteric pathogens. And again, the two that we're going to look at are Yersinia pestis, and we're going to talk a little bit about Haemophilus because it does cause a few pathogens or a few diseases early on, especially in childhood. You also can see it sometimes as a eye infection as well, and we get pink eye from that. So we'll look at that as well. Okay, and then we'll, like I said, the other part is we'll talk about some of the major diseases caused by these things as we go along. So we'll look at the organisms and talk about some of the diseases that are caused by these things. But primarily, most of these guys are found in the intestine. Some of them are not, and some of them are. The ones that are, they're typically what happens is we get endogenous infections where they end up in the wrong spot and they cause infection. So we'll look at some of these things and what happens. Okay, so that's what we're looking at today. All right, so the first ones are going to be the aerobic bacilli, and again, my favorite is Pseudomonas aeruginosa. Pseudomonas is a dead giveaway for the green color, green pigments that you associate with Pseudomonas, and so that is one of the clear ones. Also, the smell of it is kind of interesting because it's more of a sweet or grape-like type of smell. So it's very distinctive in both its looks and its smell. All right, so the aerobic gram-negative are broken down into a lot of different groups. And again, the one we're going to be looking at today first are going to be in this group, the Pseudomonas, Bordetella, and Alcaligenes. And so in that group, there's also the Legionella that we'll look at as well in that group. Then we'll get into the facultative anaerobes, and these are the enterics. These are the ones, the lactose fermenting, including E. coli, Klebsiella, Citrobacter. And then we'll look at the non-lactose fermenting, which includes Salmonella, Shigella, and that we will talk a little bit about Haemophilus, and we'll also look at Yersinia as well. And so those are the ones. We're really not going to talk about Bacteroides today, so you don't have to worry about those. but those are the main groups we're going to look at. So again, the aerobic, the lactose fermenting, and then the non-lactose fermenting groups. And again, we can see these as we go along. Okay, wide range of habitats. Most of them are found in the intestines. Some are found on animals, and others are soil and water species. And again, we'll see these as we go along. Again, most of them are not medically important. However, what happens is some of these guys are opportunists, meaning that when the immune system goes awry, that's when they infect. So Pseudomonas we see with people that have burns or may have transplants or other things going on where the immune system is weak. E. coli tends to be an endogenous type of thing, causes a lot of UTIs. When the E. coli leaves the colon and gets in other places, causes foodborne illness. We know all about that. If you've ever heard about Chipotle in the last couple of months and that stuff and those problems, and that was with E. coli. Again, the other major one that causes gastrointestinal distress is Salmonella, and Salmonella is another big one. Now, that one's not found in human intestines most of the time, but it's found in others like chickens a lot of times. So we worry about that with eggs, and that a lot of times you see it in reptiles. So again, if you have pet birds or snakes or turtles and that stuff, you have to be careful because they can harbor salmonella and that in their intestines. So again, we'll look at these guys as we go along. Okay. And then most of them, obviously, since they're gram negative, have the external membrane, which is an endotoxin. It does stay with them, that LPS, and that LPS is a very good immune response type of organism or type of response. And so that LPS itself can cause an immune response, even though the bacteria is not there. And there are situations in the medical field where we have people that get a response even though they don't have the bacteria in them, but they have the LPS in them. And again, it can cause some serious problems, especially with the immune response that they get. Okay, so the first group we're going to look at is Pseudomonas. And again, these are opportunistic infections. And here's the Pseudomonas gram stain, so little red rods. And again, one of the infections that they can cause is what we call the green nail infection. So this is actually Pseudomonas growing under the nail. It's not a fungus, it's actually Pseudomonas. You can also see it in the eyes sometimes. Contact lenses, people will get those, especially if they lick their contacts and then stick them into their eyes. You see it a lot of times in burn patients again. People that have trach tubes, you'll see Pseudomonas infections. And also with people with cystic fibrosis will also a lot of times get Pseudomonas infections in their lungs. And so that can be a nasty, nasty pathogen in that sense. Bordetella and Legionella are normally human pathogens. Bordetella causes whooping cough, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then Legionella causes Legionella pneumoniae, which is, again, a disease that a lot of times you get through respiratory. A lot of times you see it in the summer with air conditioning vents, and that actually grows in the water tanks or condensation tanks that are used, and then they have amoebas growing in there, and then the amoebas grow the bacteria, and then you get this as basically a water vapor type of thing where you get the bacteria spread to your lungs. And so we'll look at that as well. Okay, and so these are all part of this group. Okay, so Pseudomonas is a small gram-negative rod with a single polar flagellum, and you may have noticed it growing in places. So if you've seen the green growing around your sinks or sometimes the water pipes and that stuff, that isn't a fungus, but it's actually Pseudomonas, and Pseudomonas does appear green. Again, if you streak it onto a plate, it has this nice bright greenish blue color that is known as pyocyanin that it has, and so it's a real interesting distinctive trait of Pseudomonas. Okay, it's free living. Again, it's found pretty much everywhere. It's found in the soil, seawater, fresh water, colonizes plants and animals a lot of times, and we'll see that. It's important for decomposition and bioremediators, so you'll see this a lot of times with bioremediation and soil treatments and that stuff. So it is a very good, important bug, but it can also cause infections. Again, frequent contaminants in homes and clinical settings. Like I said, if you have a faucet that kind of looks like this at home, that's Pseudomonas that's growing on it. And it's very, very typical to grow in spaces where you have a lot of moisture, a lot of wetness and that, and growing in those areas. Okay, it's aerobic respiration, does not ferment carbohydrates. So again, does not ferment any of the carbohydrates, would be negative. And it does produce oxidase and catalase, so they will bubble and turn blue if you do those tests on those things. And it produces a lot of water-soluble pigments. Like I said here, this is the greenish-blue pyocyanin that's produced by Pseudomonas aeruginosa. Other Pseudomonas produce other colors, but for today we're going to primarily focus in on Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which is the blue-green color that we see with these guys. All right, so Pseudomonas aeruginosa, again, is a common inhabitant of soil and water. It is found in the intestine of about 10% in normal people, so it does sometimes make its way into the intestine. It's very resistant to soaps, dyes, quaternary ammonia, disinfectants, drugs, and drying. They're one of these guys that actually have those antibiotic pumps, so they pump out a lot of antibiotics. Very tough to get through that kind of mucousy pyocyanin layer that they have. Very difficult for antibiotics. So again, a lot of times they are very difficult to treat when you do get these types of infections. Very common contaminant, ventilators, IV solutions, and anesthesia equipment because they are found in water, found in moisture, found in the air, found in the soil. So very, very interesting guy. And like I said, very likely to be an opportunistic pathogen. And again, when the immune system is down, that's where these guys attack. And so that's where you're going to see the Pseudomonas types of infections when you get this opportunistic pathogen. Okay. Okay, again, it's a common cause of nosocomial infections when the host is immunocompromised, and we see this with burns, neoplastic disease, and cystic fibrosis. For those that don't know what neoplastic disease means, that means like cancer or blood issues. In those situations, again, chemotherapy, immune system is going to be downgraded. The immune system gets pushed down, and that due to a lot of those things, and so that's where we see a lot of these things occur. Again, and complications can include pneumonia, UTIs, abscesses, you can get ear infections, and you can get corneal disease, so you can get the green eye. And you guys can look that up. It's pretty disgusting where you see people that actually have green in their eyes due to the Pseudomonas infection. Can lead to endocarditis, meningitis, and pneumonia in that case, where again you get the infection in the lungs. And this is really especially true with people with cystic fibrosis. Again, what makes this different is the grape-like odor. It's kind of a sweet smell, and the greenish-blue pigment that you get, and that's called pyocyanin. And it is multi-drug resistant. And again, here you see a lot of these guys showing clearing, but those clearings are much smaller than what you would expect for an antibiotic to work. So it is one of those things where it has a lot of multi-resistance to it. Okay? All right, so let's get a concept checked here. The main reservoir for Pseudomonas aeruginosa is what? Soil and water, infected individuals, asymptomatic carriers, or wild animals. Where do we find Pseudomonas the most? Okay, if you said soil and water, you'd be correct because that's where we find it. It's an opportunistic, so it's not really carried on infected individuals. I mean, you'll find it there, but it's not the most likely or main reservoir for them. Also, asymptomatic carriers, yes, you do have about 10% of the population that has it, but the main area that you're going to find these guys is in the soil and the water. Remember the drain pipes and everything else, the faucets and that stuff, that's where these guys grow. Think of it as a ubiquitous organism. It pretty much grows everywhere. Okay, good old Pseudomonas. All right, and the next one is Bordetella pertussis, and this is the microorganism that causes whooping cough. And again, it's a minute encapsulated coccobacillus, meaning it's kind of in between a round and a rod-shaped bacteria. It's the main cause of pertussis or whooping cough, which is a communicable childhood infection. It's an acute respiratory syndrome, and again, often severe life-threatening complications in babies. So you remember, immune systems don't develop really well until you're about 1 or 2 years old, and so the immune system has a really hard time fighting this off. And again, reservoir, healthy carriers. So again, people go and want to grab and hug babies and hold them and that stuff, and they can be carriers of this disease, and they can spread it to a baby very easily if they have a cough or they're carrying it, and then they spread on those water droplets. Again, transmission is either through direct contact or inhalation of aerosols. So that's where we see it. And again, passing it on. So you got to protect yourself and the baby. Again, you can look over here how this spreads. So again, basically what happens is the droplets are inhaled. The bacteria hook onto the cells of the throat. You see the cilia and that, and the horse-like hair, or the whose hair-like cilia sweep in objects. They get in and they start to reproduce and migrate into the ciliated cells of the lungs. They release a toxin that paralyzes and kills these cells. And so basically what happens is it builds up this phlegm, and it starts as deep whooping type cough that goes along because you're trying to clear the lungs and you can't do it because all those cells are getting destroyed in that, and so the tiny air sacs become infected, and so it's real difficult to get rid of it, especially when you're a little baby because you don't know any better and you're trying to get rid of it, and it can be a nightmare trying to treat this disease, especially if they're very, very small. Okay, and so that's where we see it. Healthy carriers breathing in the aerosols, and then again, babies, if they're not vaccinated for it, can get this disease. Okay, again, virulence factors, receptors recognize and bind to the ciliated receptor cells, epithelial cells. Again, toxins destroy and dislodge these epithelial cells. And the loss of the ciliated mechanism, so again, that's used to get things out of your lungs, causes a buildup of mucus and blockage of the airways. So it kind of only almost develops a pneumonia on the mucus that is formed and it can't be moved. It's kind of like the combination of flu with the bacterial pneumonia when we talked about strep pneumoniae and how the fluid develops and you can't get rid of it. Okay, there is a vaccine for it, the DTaP, and again, we've seen numbers go up as people stop being vaccinated. So go get vaccinated, because what happens is people that are non-vaccinated are going to be the ones at risk for getting it, because those that are healthy carry the disease that are vaccinated and can pass it on to those that can't be vaccinated. So that's where we see the problem. So you have to be very careful, especially when you're around someone that hasn't been vaccinated. You may be a carrier and not even know it. And so that's the scary thing about it. But like I said, if you can get vaccinated, get vaccinated. It's part of the trivalent vaccine with diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. So it's the DTaP. If you get the DTaP when you get your next tetanus shot, ask for the DTaP and you get all three, and you'll be protected for your kids. And so you can get all three of those, and it's likely recommended every about 10 years. So again, if you haven't been vaccinated in a while with those, you might as well go get vaccinated again. Or if you don't remember, you're safer just getting vaccinated, and then you don't have to worry about it at all. Okay, so that's Bordetella pertussis. Now, another one that's common in the normal flora is Alcaligenes. Again, it's another one that lives in the soil and the water, but we do see it in normal flora. And again, sometimes Alcaligenes faecalis can cause problems. Again, mostly opportunistic infections. Sometimes you do see it as a UTI in other places, but it can cause opportunistic infections, including pneumonia, septicemia, and meningitis. It's just another one of those aerobic gram-negative rods that really don't ferment anything, but it is one of those opportunistic infections like Pseudomonas and Bordetella. One of those aerobic guys that are out there, okay? Another opportunistic infection. Now, the last group, or last one that we're going to talk about, is Legionella pneumophilia, and this is the one that causes the pneumonia, and so Legionnosis. And again, it's widely distributed in water, and the reason for this is that it lives in a close association with amoebas. And so here you can see the amoebas, and they have loads and loads of bacteria growing in the inside of them. And so you can see here, these are growing on the plates, and you can see here's the amoeba cell full of wonderful Legionella. And so what happens? Well, this all came about in about 1976. There was an epidemic of pneumonia afflicting the American Legion members, and so that's where it got its name, from the Legionella, or the Legionnaires, Legion members that got the disease. Okay, Legionnaire's disease and Pontiac fever, because there was another case out in Pontiac, Michigan, where you saw the same type of thing, and it was caused by the same agent. It's prevalent in males over 50, and again, the immune system goes down. It's a nosocomial disease in elderly patients because they can spread it through the air. Again, it's spread through airborne droplets and water vapor. Causes fever, cough, diarrhea, abdominal pain, pneumonia, and a fatality rate of anywhere from 3 to 30%. And again, there is treatment with azithromycin, but how do people get it? And so this is the interesting one. So we see a lot of cases actually develop over the summer. So if you take a look at the MMWR on Legionella pneumophilia, you'll see that this has definite low points and high points during the year. Where we see it the most is actually in the summertime. And what happens is that it comes in water supplies. That water is drawn into reservoirs, and then in these reservoirs are typically used to cool down older buildings. So a lot of times you'll see these older buildings in the big cities that have the water tanks on them. those water tanks are wonderful breeding grounds for those amoebas. So those amoebas then are in that water and they replicate along with the bacteria. And then that water gets transferred into these chillers, and these chillers cool the air down by taking that water and cooling it off. And so what happens is that cool water is then sprayed into the air as a fine mist, and that's what cools you off as the air conditioning. Little do you know, you are breathing in all those wonderful little bacteria. Now, most people don't have any problems if they're young and healthy and their immune systems are working. But as you get older, this is more and more of an increased risk where people will actually develop the disease and develop pneumonia. And so this can be the scary thing. So in the summertime, you have to be careful. If you use vaporizers at all, that's another place that you see it, where you fill up the water and you don't clean it out very often. So if you have that for your kids, either a cold water or a warm water vaporizer, make sure you clean those out, because those things can spread disease as well, because you're vaporizing the water and filling it to make it more moisture in the air. Well, of course, you're putting those bacteria in the air and making it airborne that way. So be very careful with those things. So again, make sure you just clean things out. You shouldn't have a problem. And again, if you have a really good immune system, this shouldn't be an issue. But if you're older, or if you again have some kind of immune issue, you're on antibiotics, or you got some other things going on, this can cause a problem. So just be aware of those things, okay? All right, so now we're going to move on to the enteric pathogens. So enteric means intestinal, and so that's where we see these guys. And most of the time, these guys don't cause any problems. It's when they get into the wrong spot. Either they leave the intestine, they get into an area where they're not supposed to be, like the blood, or they get into our urethra or kidneys or bladder and that stuff and cause those types of infections. And that's where you see these things. Otherwise, you see it a lot of times as a wonderful foodborne illness because people don't wash their hands after using the restroom. And so that is why you should always wash your hands. If this doesn't get you to wash your hands, then I don't know what will, and you'll just be disgusting not washing your hands. So wash your hands after using the restroom, because this is what happens, especially if you go and prepare someone's food. Okay, so again, we're talking about E. coli, and it comes from poop. Okay, so because it's probably one of the most common residents of our intestines. Okay, so again, the enterics, or the Enterobacteriaceae family, are the ones that live in our intestines. They're a large family of small, non-spore forming gram-negative rods. Again, a lot of them inhabit soil, water, decaying matter, and common occupants of large bowels of animals, including the humans. And again, the most frequent cause of diarrhea through enterotoxins. So again, get in the wrong spot and cause problems. And so we'll talk about how E. coli gets in and causes a lot of problems. Okay. Enterics, along with Pseudomonas, account for almost 50% of the nosocomial infections, and that's because people are not clean in hospitals. You get a diarrhea or something else, and then you passively spread it from one patient to another along with Pseudomonas, and that's because of the respiratory and the ventilators and things like that, because that loves to grow on the plastics. So those account for about 50% of all hospital infections right there. UTIs, huge with catheters and everything else, so we'll see that as well. Okay. Now, again, the facultative anaerobes, they grow best in air, but they can also grow without oxygen. That's why they're found in the intestines. Okay, they can ferment glucose, reduce nitrates to nitrites, oxidase negative, catalase positive. And they're divided into two groups, the coliforms, which are the lactose fermenters, and the non-coliforms, which means non-lactose fermenters. Now, if you see coli or coli here, coliform, colis, these mean members with E. coli. So E. coli obviously is a lactose fermenter. Okay, and so we'll look at that. You can see here, lactose fermenter versus non-lactose fermenter. And you guys that are taking my class will be doing this with the selective differential media right before spring break. So when we do that day, what we're going to be looking at is lactose versus non-lactose fermenters. So this fits in perfectly, because you guys are going to be looking at the difference between a coliform and a non-coliform, which means lactose fermenter versus non. Again, enrichment, selective, and differential media are used for screening these guys, and these are very typical, especially when they're treating wastewater and looking at water and a lot of other things, because they're looking to see, did poop get in the water? And if it does, that's when we have to boil our water and do a lot of other things. So this is what we're looking at when we do these types of things. Okay. All right, so this just shows you a little map. So this would be very helpful if you're doing an unknown for your class. Again, kind of takes you through and looking at the enteric genera, which is again the gram-negative bacilli. And so this will tell you some of the tests you can run to again and give you what species you're at. And again, we're going to be looking at some of these. We're primarily going to focus on E. coli, but we'll also look at Klebsiella. We may take a quick look at Citrobacter, and then we'll look at Proteus, Serratia, Salmonella, and Yersinia, along with Shigella, a couple of different ones. So we'll see a lot of these different organisms pop up as we go along. You guys will also see this when we actually do the gram-negative testing here in a couple weeks after spring break, and we get that done. And so we'll see these again and again. So just keep in mind of the tests. You'll see some of these tests, citrate, indole, and that stuff, and we'll see these tests again as we run them throughout the class. Okay, so the antigenic structures and virulence factors, and again, remember all these guys are gram-negative, so they have this toxin on the outside. That's called the endotoxin, so that's part of it. And then we describe these guys based on what types of antigens do they have on their cell walls. Okay, so we describe them as the H antigen, which is the flagellar antigen. A lot of these guys have flagella. We describe them with their K antigen, the capsule and fimbral antigens, and then the O antigen, which is somatic or cell wall antigen. And again, this is all of them have. And so typically you'll see like an E. coli. If we say an E. coli strain, we may say O55H20 or something like that. So you get these different types of strains based on the type of antigen they have on there. One of the nasty guys is the wonderful E. coli O157, which is the one that really causes problems, and that's the one that really gets people sick. That's the hemorrhagic one, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. That's the nasty E. coli where you get the really severe bloody diarrhea. And we'll look at that one here in just a second, but that's how we describe them based on their antigens. So a lot of times you'll get E. coli, but then you'll see the substrains, and that's based on the H's and the K's and the O's and that stuff. And I'm not going to ask you on the test, but it's a way to identify the different strains of E. coli and other enterics that we talk about here in the class. Okay, so which is the following is true of the enterics? Some are normal flora, some release endotoxin, some release enterotoxin. All of the above are true. What do you think is true there? Okay, hopefully you're paying attention and you saw that all of the above are true because again, they're part of our normal flora. They have the endotoxin, that's the LPS, and some do release enterotoxins as well on top of the endotoxin there. And we'll describe those here in a little bit. And that's what causes a lot of times the diarrhea that we see. So if you said all are true, you got it right. Good job. All right, so let's talk about the lactose fermenters. And again, this includes those like E. coli. Other members are Klebsiella, Citrobacter, and Enterobacter. These are all four of these are typically lactose fermenters, and these would be positive on a lactose plate if you're looking at lactose. So these would be growing dark or purple on a lactose fermenting plate. Okay. So again, E. coli is probably the most prevalent enteric bacillus. We've got more of this than anything else in our guts, and again, it's the most common aerobic and non-fastidious bacterium in our gut. There's about 150 different strains, and again, the way we describe the strains is their H's, O's, and K's and that stuff. And again, we look at this, and some of them are more pathogenic than others. The ones that we use in the lab are very lab strainy, and so they're very inert and they won't cause any problems. Again, though, you want to handle it with care because any of those things can cause problems as they go along. Some have developed virulence factors through plasma transfers, and others are opportunists, and again, getting in the wrong spot. So a lot of times we see these guys causing UTIs, kidney infections, bladder infections because they get in the wrong spot at the wrong time. Okay, and so that's where we see it. All right, so we have actually some pathogenic strains, and we describe them based on what type of diarrhea you get associated with it. So the first one is the enterotoxigenic, and this is one that releases an enterotoxin. So we talked about the endotoxin. This is one that stays with the bacteria, that's the LPS. Well, some of these guys can also release a secondary toxin, which stimulates the intestinal cells to release their water, and that's where you get the wonderful watery diarrhea. So again, this E. coli causes severe diarrhea due to heat libel toxin and the heat stable toxin, and they stimulate secretion and fluid loss, and it also has fimbriae. And this is one of the most common types of E. coli infections that people get. So I'd say 70% of the traveler's diarrhea is this enterotoxigenic type. Okay, so one of those. Okay, Then you have the enteroinvasive. This is where actually the E. coli gets into the intestine and starts causing you to have wonderful infections in the intestine. A lot of times you will get associated this with blood in the stool. So then you get kind of a bloody diarrhea. So wonderful enteroinvasive. So that means it actually is causing an inflammatory disease of the large intestine. So sometimes people get like a colitis associated. So you get pain, cramping, and bloody diarrhea associated with that. So it doesn't leave the intestine, but it can cause severe distress in the intestine and cause a lot of problems. Now, the enteropathogenic is linked to the chronic wasting form of infantile diarrhea. So a lot of times we see this in babies associated with drinking dirty water. And so they get this disease and they have this constant diarrhea. They can't replenish their fluids, and so they get severely dehydrated. And so it's this wasting away because they just can't keep anything down. They're constantly having diarrhea associated with this. And then the last one is the enterohemorrhagic. Again, this is that 0157 strain, H7 strain. And again, this is the one that you typically hear about with foodborne illnesses. Causes the hemorrhagic syndrome and kidney damage. So not only do these guys cause bloody diarrhea, but they actually work their way into the blood system. The blood system then carries them to the kidney where they can cause kidney damage and kidney failure. So this was associated with the really severe stuff. I'm not just talking about some bad burritos here. This is the stuff that actually gets in, and you'll have bloody diarrhea. You have very intense sickness. You'll have kidney damage and could lead to kidney failure, which could lead to death. And so these guys, the enterohemorrhagic, can actually cause death. And so these, when you hear about the severe cases where E. coli has killed a couple of people, this is the strain that does it, this 0157. This is probably the most invasive of all of them, causing the most problems. And again, not only do you get the bloody diarrhea, but then it leads to kidney damage and kidney failure over time. And so we worry about this the most. Probably the most common type is the enterotoxigenic. Like I said, about 70% of all travelers' diarrhea is due to the enterotoxigenic. So that's the Montezuma's revenge. You go down to Mexico, you drink the water, or you eat fruit that's been washed with the water, and now you're on the toilet for a couple of days. That's due to this type of E. coli. Why don't the natives worry about that? It's because they've grown up with that. Their immune systems can tolerate it. We haven't been exposed to it, and so we get the disease. Isn't that great? Okay. So again, the pathogenic strains are frequent agents of infantile diarrhea, and that's the greatest cause of mortality among babies. And again, the biggest thing with these things is dehydration, because when you associate diarrhea, diarrhea causes the fluid loss. When we get fluid loss, you get dehydration, and that's what kills people is the dehydration. It's not so much the infection, it's the dehydration, loss of electrolytes, and not being able to keep anything down. So it's basically, again, not being able to eat and keep anything down along with the dehydration, which kills people. Like I said, about 70% of the enterotoxigenic is due to traveler's diarrhea. And again, about 50 to 80% of all UTIs is caused by E. coli just ending up in the wrong spot. So it goes from the intestine into the urinary tract. And again, based on anatomy, I'm not trying to make judgments here about anything, about anyone's habits, but based on anatomy, women are more likely because of just the proximity of the rectum to, or the anus to the urethra in that case. But again, doesn't mean men can't get it either. So that is a very common cause both in men and women. But like I said, women are more likely just based on anatomy. Again, we also do coliform counts. And so when we're looking at wastewater, we're always looking at the coliform count. So if you ever see something like if you go to a lake or something, they have the beach closed and they say due to bacterial contamination, a lot of times it's due to fecal runoff or fecal contamination that's gotten into the lake. So here in Milwaukee, a lot of times we have issues with Bradford Beach, and that's because the wastewater, when we get a really heavy rain, what happens is instead of flooding the homes, what we do is we let the wastewater go out into the lake. And so because of that, it makes the beaches right around where that water treatment area is unsafe for a little while until it can dilute out, and then eventually it dilutes out enough so it's safe again. So you may see this especially in the summertime when they close the beaches due to the water counts. Also, when you see this is when you have a water main break, because wastewater and fresh water are mixing together, and so that's when they tell you to boil your water for 15 minutes. And you guys know from my lab, we did the test, and that really 10 minutes is more than enough time to kill E. coli in this case. But just to make sure you always boil it for 10 minutes just to get rid of anything, and so you're safe from that. Okay? So that's E. coli for us. All right, another one that causes issues is Klebsiella pneumoniae, and again, it's a normal inhabitant of the respiratory tract. It has a large capsule, causes nosocomial pneumonia, meningitis, bacteremia, wound infections, and UTIs. And again, a lot of times this is due to passage, so not being clean and passing it from one person to another. And so typically it doesn't bother us in a respiratory tract. Respiratory droplets getting in places, if you have immune suppression, you're more likely to get this endogenous type of infection. So again, self-inoculation in that and getting this disease. Okay. Another one, again, is Enterobacter, where we see it as UTIs, surgical wounds. Citrobacter, the same thing, opportunistic UTIs and bacteremia. Like I said, a lot of these guys are caused in the hospitals because we have catheters and other things inserted in those areas, and bacteria love to grow on these things. And so whenever you put plastics into people, bacteria love to grow and cling onto these things, and that leads to always an infection. So if you have a catheter or a respiratory tube, like a trachea tube, you're more than likely going to develop either pneumonia or a UTI based on the tubes that are put into you. It's just one of those things. It's very difficult to keep clean all the time, and it's probably more than likely you're going to develop it no matter how clean you are. A lot of times these things just love to stick. Now, one that we've used in the lab quite a bit is Serratia, and again, it has a distinctive red color associated with it growing in the media. And again, it produces a nice bright red pigment. You see it sometimes with pneumonia, burn and wound infections. It can lead to septicemia and meningitis. And again, this guy typically found in soil, in the air. Sometimes you'll see it growing in your bathtubs and the faucets and that stuff. But when people have, problems with their immune system, that's when you can see these things cause problems. Okay. And so typically with any of these guys, when these get introduced to areas that they're not supposed to be and your immune system is weak, that sets up the situation for these types of infections. Very, very similar in all these different things. Okay. All right. So let's move on to the non-lactose fermenters. And again, I like this picture because it's welcome to your new home, Salmonella. And so all these different things here you see on this picture can be carriers of salmonella. So we think of chicken, we think of dairy, eggs, sometimes pork, and even our wonderful salad. If you get bag salad, sometimes this happens because that sometimes they don't get cleaned properly or they get washed, but they get washed with water that's contaminated with animal feces. And so that's how these things end up on your leaves and that stuff. And so always, always wash your fruits and vegetables. And again, use different cutting boards for poultry and pork and things like this, and you should be safe every time. Okay, so a lot of times these are caused by just having dirty habits. Okay, so again, Proteus and its relatives. This is another opportunist, and again, ordinarily harmless saprobes. And again, we find it in soil, manure, sewage, polluted water, and commensals of human and animals. And again, Proteus, and you guys will notice this when we work with it a couple of times. I don't think, yeah, I think we will work with it maybe with the selective and differential. But after that, we will definitely work with it in the gram-negative testing, and you will realize how bad this one. I think this is one of the worst smelling ones, and this is one of the reasons why poop really stinks, and that can be the Proteus that people have. But it is an opportunist again. It's involved in UTIs, wound infections, pneumonia, septicemia, and infant diarrhea. And again, typically with Proteus, it's an interesting one because it has this swarming motility. And so if you try and streak this out like a streak plate, try for isolated colonies, you can almost never get isolated colonies with Proteus. And the reason for that is this guy has this swarming motility. So what it does is it uses the fimbriae and pili to actually twitch and swarm out from the center. So what we typically do with Proteus is you can inoculate it in a center or on a circle, and you can watch it actually move away from the circle. So you can see here's a ring of Proteus and another ring and another ring, and you can see it over here as well. So it kind of swarms out from the outside and goes to the outside in that way. It's kind of an unusual one. And again, I guarantee you'll know Proteus because one, by the smell, and two, you can't isolate it. So it just kind of looks like it just grows all over the plate. Kind of looks like an empty plate until you open it up and you go, oh God, that's pretty bad. And so that's where you see Proteus a lot of times. Some other ones, Morganella and Provincia, are also involved in similar infections. So typically, again, only opportunistic infections, immune system down. So when you see that, that's where you associate these types of infections. Okay, so the two that we're primarily worried about in the non-lactose fermenters are Salmonella and Shigella. And these are well-developed virulence factors. They're primary pathogens and not typically found in humans of the intestines. Okay, so we talk about Salmonelloses and Shigelloses, and so those are the two that cause the foodborne illnesses. And again, improper preparation or in non-proper preparation, I should say, of chicken and other things can cause this to spread. And so typically this is due to contaminated food or drink. When you mix things together, use the same cutting board to cut your meats along with your veggies and things like this. And so it's this cross contamination. So this is always the one where they use the glow bug and they show you, oh, look how it spreads all over the house if you're not careful. And this is salmonella that causes this problem. Okay, some gastrointestinal involvement and diarrhea, but it can affect other systems as well. So it typically doesn't just stay in the intestine, but actually works its way out of the intestine and causes more problems. And so that's where you see the salmonella problems. Okay, so over here you can see how the salmonella infection occurs. Okay, it's contaminated food or drink. The food or drink goes down the intestine, and then once it gets into the small intestine, they adhere into the lining and begin their life cycle. Again, in severe cases, they can break through and get into the bloodstream and can be deadly if not properly treated. Okay, and the symptoms include within 12 to 72 hours nausea, vomiting, fever, diarrhea, abdominal cramps. In 4 to 7 days, their illness ranges from mild to severe, and most people can recover without treatment. But again, if it does get into the severe things, that's where it can cause problems. And the most severe cases, again, are people with weakened immune systems. Infants, elderly, and impaired systems. And again, there are some oral injected antibiotics, and it usually takes about 2 weeks to clear the infection once you get it. So again, improper handling of food is one of the ways people get this infection quite a bit. And again, it's because it's found in animal intestines, not in human intestines. Okay, so the typhoid fever and other salmonelloses, again, the typical one is the Salmonella typhi, and it's the most serious pathogen of the genus, and it causes typhoid fever. And so you probably have heard of Typhoid Mary. Typhoid Mary was a lady that actually was a asymptomatic carrier, I should say. She actually had this in her intestines, and she would not wash herself after using the restroom. So she'd get this stuff on her hands. And she was a nanny in London during this time. And what would happen is the kids that she was taking care of would constantly get these salmonella infections, and they didn't know how it was happening. Well, finally, they treated and figured out that she was the cause, and she was actually banned from ever coming with childcare or working with people because of her condition. Well, it turns out a couple of years later, they found her actually working in a like a soup kitchen type of thing, feeding the homeless, and because the homeless people were complaining and getting sick from salmonella, and of course she turns up again. And so that's where the whole name of Typhoid Mary comes from. If you're the spreader of disease, sometimes you get labeled as Typhoid Mary. Well, that's where this comes from, the Salmonella typhi that people had. Now, another one that people get from pork, undercooked pork, is the cholerae, the Salmonella cholerae suis, which is found in pork, in the intestines of pigs. And then the other one is the enteritis, which again, there's about 1,700 types, serotypes based on the O, H, and V variations. And again, they survive outside the host. They're very resistant chemicals. And this is the one most people will get when they get a salmonella infection. And so this is typically found in the poultry, carried by reptiles, and the eggs and that stuff. So this is the one that we worry most about with salmonella. It doesn't cause a lot of disease, but it can cause severe diarrhea, cramping. Sometimes it can lead to more serious infections, but typically in most healthy people, the worst thing you're going to get is a really bad case of diarrhea associated with this. And again, improper handling of food and taking care of that stuff will lead to this disease. Okay. Again, we see that this is the normal rates, and you can see the number of reported cases every year about, again, out of 100,000. So between 10 and 15 people out of 100,000. So, that's a pretty good number that you see. And then the numbers went up when there was an outbreak in pasteurized milk in Illinois in 1986. And you can see the numbers have stayed fairly consistent over the years. And you can see that the number of cases really hasn't changed much. And there's always outbreaks. And typically, again, we see it associated with chicken, poultry, pork, and then sometimes we do see outbreaks again in dairy products, and then also sometimes in leafy greens and that stuff, and that's used because typically the water used to wash the veggies are contaminated with salmonella from animal runoff, and so that's where you see that. Okay, so typhoid fever, what happens is the bacteria, here's the typhus bacteria, enters into the intestine, so it actually gets through the villi. Okay, so it doesn't stay in the intestine, but actually gets in and then gets into the blood. Now, what can happen is that it can ulcerate the intestine, so you can actually see perforations and ulcers in the intestine, which can cause some serious complications. And here you can see down below, here's one of my wonderful, disgusting pictures of ulcers in the intestine. So you can see this is someone that had ulcerative colitis, and it was probably due to salmonella, and again, the bacteria getting in and destroying the tissue. Again, there are asymptomatic carriers that actually carry this in their intestines. There are some chronic carriers that will shed the bacilli from the gallbladder. So they get into the gallbladder and then they live in the gallbladder. The bacilli adhere to the small intestine, cause invasive diarrhea that leads to septicemia. And again, there are some drugs to treat it, and there are some vaccines for temporary protection, especially if you're going into areas where there's lots of contamination, endemic for Salmonella typhus or typhi. You may see this, and so you may be given a vaccine if you're going into one of these areas that's endemic. Okay, and so there are some temporary protection out there. Other salmonelloses, again, the ones that are the enteritis, again, other than typhoid fever, are called enteric fevers. And again, this causes the food poisoning. So typhi is the worst. That causes the most complicated symptoms. But most people, when they get salmonella, they're getting this enteritis, which basically is an inflammation of the intestine. Okay, it's less severe, but more prevalent. And again, it's caused by many of the serotypes of the enteritis. They're all from animals, but humans can become carriers, again, if they get the disease. Typically, we see it in cattle, poultry, rodents, reptiles, animals, and dairy products. And again, fomites contaminated with intestinal flora, that's how it spreads. So this is the one you get from your chicken. This is the one you get from your eggs. So that's why they recommend using different cutting boards, again, when you're using chicken or meat, because that's how salmonella can get in. And again, think of animals and processing and that stuff. Sometimes intestinal goop gets mixed in with the meats and that stuff, so you have to think about that. The second place that you see this again was with eggs, and so again with poultry, it's a common inhabitant of the intestines, and so again when they lay eggs in that, you have the mixing sometimes of intestinal flora with the egg laying and that stuff, so you see that. And so it's typically on the outside of eggs, not on the inside, but on the outside. And so when you crack the egg, you want to make sure you don't get shell in the egg, and if you do, that you either fish it out, or you make sure you really cook that egg, because that might have a potential risk for salmonella. That's why you should always crack eggs in a different bowl first before you mix it in, because of that risk. The other place you see this is if people have pet snakes or turtles or that stuff, and they handle them and that stuff, again, found in intestinal flora of the reptiles, you can get the disease. Also in birds, so again, that's another place. If you have a pet bird, you can get this as well. So these are ones that typically not found in humans, but can spread to humans based on mixing of the flora. So that's how we get that. Okay. Now, another type of enteric dysentery is the shigellosis, and this is an incapacitating dysentery. And again, there's a couple of different strains that are the most common types of dysentery. These are human parasites, and they get into the villus of the large intestine. They don't break through the intestine or invade the blood, so they stay in the intestine. But what they can do is they can get into the Peyer's patches, which is basically the immune system part of the intestines, okay, and cause an inflammatory response, including from their endotoxin and exotoxin, so causing problems that way by releasing these toxins. It's a lot of times referred to as a Shiga toxin. I like saying Shiga, and it's a Shiga toxin that can cause damage. Again, typically most people get through it, get through this disease a lot of times, and so you'll see it sometimes where people have severe diarrhea. And again, the biggest thing is getting fluid replacement, so you might have to go to the hospital and get IVs and that stuff. The other issue you want to do is make sure you get your electrolytes. So a lot of times things like Pedialyte is a great tool, because again, you don't have a lot of sugar like Gatorade, but it allows you to maintain your electrolyte balance in your intestines as well as getting fluids. And so if you can keep that stuff down, that's a good thing. But if you constantly have diarrhea and you're not keeping it down, you need to go to the hospital and get treatment for that. Okay. Sometimes if it's bad enough, they will give you an antibiotic, but a lot of times they pretty much just rehydrate you and try and keep you as hydrated as possible, and then this infection will pass. Okay, and so that's what we see with shigellosis. All right, so let's say your nephew gets gastroenteritis after cleaning out his pet snake's aquarium. The most likely pathogen, what do you think is? Shigella dysentery, Serratia marcescens, Salmonella typhi, or Salmonella entertidins? God, I can't say it. Entertiditis. There we go, entertiditis. So Salmonella entertiditis, typhi, marcescens, or dysentery. Which one do you think is caused by getting cleaned out of a snake's cage? Okay, if you paid any attention at all, I was talking about salmonella, and again, reptiles, and the most common cause of gastroenteritis is Salmonella entertiditis, and so that's the one that causes the biggest issue in most cases. Again, typhi is a really severe case where it can get in the blood, bloody diarrhea, and that stuff. And so they're not saying any bloody diarrhea; they're just saying gastroenteritis, which would be again sometimes nausea, vomiting, but typically a watery diarrhea, which is typically associated with the Salmonella entertiditis. Okay, and then again, the snakes, common inhabitant of reptiles. So good job if you got it right. Okay, now the other group is the enteric Yersinia pathogens, and this is Yersinia enterocolitica. And again, this is domestic in wild animals, fish, fruits, vegetables, and water. And this is a very common thing that you see up in the, actually, if you go to Northern Europe in like Finland, uh, whereas Scandinavia countries like Norway and Sweden and that stuff, a lot of times they have this incorporated in foods like deer meat and some of the other ones, elk and that stuff. And so you'll see this. It's typically a foodborne infection, even though it's called Yersinia. This one is a foodborne along with the pseudotuberculosis. So if you do go to those countries and you do eat some of the native dishes and that stuff, just be aware to have it cooked properly, because if you don't, there's a possibility of you getting this type of disease. So you do see this a lot of times, especially in Northern Europe and that. And so they do talk about it. Again, the pseudotuberculosis is an infection caused by, similar to enterocolitica, has more lymph node involvement, and that's typically associated with Yersinia. Yersinia likes to get into the lymph nodes and causing problems. The one I really want to talk about today is a non-enteric pathogen, which is the wonderful guy that causes the plague. And so I like this picture because this is the Black Death, bring out your death. And this was the plague outfit that people would wear to protect themselves from getting the plague. And so you can kind of see, kind of protects them. It's this leather garment that kind of keeps them covered and protected. And again, everything covered so that they don't get exposed to the Black Death at this time. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about Yersinia pestis. So let's talk about the non-enteric Yersinia pestis and the plague. So now the two before I was talking about were the ones that are typically found in the intestines. Yersinia pseudotuberculosis and Yersinia enterocolitica are typically intestinal forms of the species. This one is typically associated with blood. And so we see these guys getting infected with Yersinia pestis by getting bites from insects. And so that's typically how this spreads. So we call this a non-enteric pathogen. It's a tiny gram-negative rod. It usually has bipolar staining in capsules, and so you can kind of see some of the different stains and that stuff. It has virulence factors, including a capsular and envelope proteins that protects against phagocytosis, and they foster intercellular growth. Again, you have coagulase, endotoxin, and murine toxin, which can all cause problems when you get this disease. Okay. Now, Yersinia pestis still causes infections in the world, even though you don't hear a lot about it. We still have infections that actually occur in the Western United States, and that humans develop the disease based on getting bit by fleas. And so these fleas are from getting in contact with wild animals, either getting bit by the wild animals or getting bit by animals that are bit by fleas. And so this is the main carrier of the organism Yersinia pestis. And so when I was back in microbiology, back in my undergraduate days, it was kind of funny. My microbiology teacher was talking about the plague, and the first thing he wrote on there was rats. He just wrote rats on there, and rats cause the plague. He's right in a sense that rats carry the plague, and a lot of warm-blooded mammals will carry the plague. The issue is the fleas. The fleas are the ones that actually spread the disease. And so what happens is these warm-blooded animals will get bit by fleas, they get the disease, and then these fleas bite other animals along the way and pass the disease. And so again, They're found in about 200 species of mammals, rodents, without causing disease. Where we see it causing disease is in humans when fleas bite us. Okay, and again, you see it all over around the world. And again, there are still cases of plague in the United States. And so, again, we have roughly about 10 cases a year. It's not a lot, but I think people are still shocked to hear that people get Yersinia pestis or get plague and go to the hospital. When this happens, they do definitely show the signs of disease and that stuff, and they can die from it. But typically with modern medicine, with antibiotics and that stuff, you're pretty well okay and treatable as long as you get to the hospital in a reasonable amount of time. Again, what carries this is the fleas, and again, the bacteria replicates in the gut. And what happens is that it basically causes or fills up the esophagus and prevents the flea from taking another meal. So it makes the flea extra hungry. So it wants to bite lots of animals because it can't feed. And so it keeps biting animals, and every time it bites, it spreads a little more bacteria around. So that's why this thing is a nasty little pathogen. You know how small these fleas are. If you've ever had a dog with fleas or cats with fleas, you know they're really tiny. And once they get into your house, very difficult to get rid of. And so that's one of those things you have to worry about with fleas. Now, around here and that stuff, not a big deal. But out west, the main carrier of Yersinia pestis is prairie dogs, and prairie dogs have it. And so, again, if you like to hike out west and that stuff, you're at risk of getting plague if you do get bit by fleas out there. You come in contact with these animals. Now, typically what happens, again, fleas will bite these different mammals that carry it. Again, they're basically asymptomatic carriers, and these fleas will pass and then they'll bite humans. And once they get to humans, we're accidental hosts because they're looking for a blood meal. We get bit, and it spreads to us and causes disease. And so there's a couple of different types of plague that we can get. Most people get what is known as bubonic plague, and that is the inflammation of the lymph nodes, which are called buboes, and we'll look at that in a second. However, if people do not get that treated and let that go, it can become systemic and actually go to the lungs and cause pneumonic plague, which can be spread through air droplets and then get them sick through spreading of the air droplets. So during the time of the Black Death, people were actually getting pneumonic plague because people would get the disease from the fleas. They obviously didn't have any medical care at the time, or very little medical care at the time. Would get systemically infected with the bacteria and then spread it through the respiratory droplets and spread it to other people. And that's how these things would spread. Okay. Pathology of the plague, the idea is anywhere from 3 to 50 bacteria. So not a lot of bacteria needed to get you sick. And again, there are 3 types of plague that actually can occur. The first type is bubonic, which is the one where you get bit by the flea. And what happens is that the bacteria disseminate from the bite into the lymph system, and then they form large swellings in the lymph nodes called buboes. And so the 2 areas that you typically see it is either in the armpit or groin. That's where you're going to see these large swellings. And so that would be bubonic plague. If you have that, that's when you want to go get treated, because if you don't let that go, you can go to what is called septicemic plague or systemic plague. This is essentially where it leaves the buboes and then starts going throughout the body and the blood. And this can cause hemorrhaging, causes a lot of other things. And this is the Black Death, because basically what happens is tissue becomes black and necrotic. You start to see people losing limbs and things like this. And this is the Black Death part, because people would hemorrhage all over, and that's the Black Plague. Now, sometimes the septicemic or systemic plague can go to the lungs. Once it gets into the lungs, it then becomes pneumonic, and then the bacteria take a new form, which can then be spread through airborne droplets. And when that happens, it becomes very, very easy to spread. It becomes very communicable as a disease. Bubonic itself is not communicable, again, unless you have fleas that are infected. Septicemic is a little bit more, because obviously you're at risk because you have fluids and other things that can spread. But pneumonic is very serious because it can be spread through the air. And this is a serious type of infection. This is the one that you really don't want, because, again, it's fatal, it's highly contagious, and you can spread it to a lot of people very quickly. And so it's one of those things that can be very, very scary if left untreated. Okay, so again, the diagnosis depends on the history and the symptoms. Obviously, the buboes, and then the lab finding from aspiration to see if you have it. And you can see in the United States, here are the number of cases, and you can see most of them were out west. And I think the one in Chicago was probably someone who came from out west and did that, because that's where we see most of the infections. And so this is over, again, about a 40-year period, and you can see most of the infections out west. And that's again associated with the prairie dogs and the mammals out there. And typically you see it in people that go hiking out in the wilderness, they get bit by fleas, come back, and then they get the disease. Okay. Again, there is a killed or attenuated vaccine available. I know some military personnel are vaccinated for sometimes of these because it could be used as a biological weapon potentially. And again, the biggest thing is quarantine whenever someone comes in. Again, the few cases that do come in, they quarantine them right away, keep them away from those. And again, maintaining and controlling the rodent population is the biggest thing, because if you can do that, you don't have the fleas biting them and you don't have it spreading to humans, and that's the biggest thing. Or also flea prevention as well, so that's another way to keep the fleas away, and so you can keep yourself from getting sick. Okay, so that's how the plague is spread. So the bubo of the bubonic plague is an ulcer where the flea bite occurred, a granuloma in the skin, the enlarged lymph node, or the infectious sebaceous gland. What is a bubo in a person that has bubonic plague? If you said enlarged lymph node, you would be correct. Good job. Nice going. Okay, so now we have Haemophilus. This is one of the last ones, and then we're done for today. Haemophilus is a tiny gram-negative pleomorphic rod, so again, doesn't have a real defined shape. It's fastidious, sensitive to drying and temperature extremes and disinfections. None can grow on blood agar without special techniques, and sometimes you even need chocolate agar to do that. And again, it requires blood, and a lot of times hemonin, NAD, and NADP. And again, several species are normal colonists of the upper respiratory tract or vagina, including parainfluenzae and Ducrey. Okay, so those are a couple that are spread. The Ducrey is actually a STD that can be passed, and the parainfluenzae is one that gets spread by young kids. And sometimes you see this as the flu-like symptoms that are caused, but it's actually caused by bacteria. Others are virulent species responsible for childhood meningitis and chancroid, which is the STD that's caused by these. Okay, the Haemophilus influenzae is a bacterial meningitis, epiglottis, otitis media, which is ear infection, sinusitis, pneumonia, and bronchitis, and again, typically seen in young kids. There is a subunit vaccine now, and you can see the numbers as soon as the vaccine was available, the numbers of people that actually get it. So the numbers have gone down quite a bit in the recent history, and so we don't see this very often. Again, the only people we see this in typically are the non-immune or the non-vaccinated type of thing. Again, the immune issues or non-vaccinated. Typically, again, a childhood disease that can spread, especially if you're in close contact with one another. Respiratory droplets do spread this and typically mimics a lot like the flu, so that's why it's called influenza, but it does not cause the flu. So again, the flu is caused by a virus, this is a bacteria, and so you get flu-like symptoms, but it's not caused by the flu. Okay, another one is the Aegyptus. This leads to what is called pink eye, and so this is the conjunctivitis and pink eye. So a lot of times people will get this. That's a severe. Now there are different types of pink eye, but this is one type, Haemophilus, that causes the pink eye. And then the Ducrey is the chancroid STD, so it forms a nice, wonderful, fiery hot pimple on the genitalia, and so that's an infection that can spread from person to person through sexual contact. And again, typically that's a common STD that we see. And then the parainfluenzae and the Haemophilus are normal oral and nasopharyngeal flora and can cause infective endocarditis, again, if it gets in the wrong spot. So again, with Haemophilus, again, it's a gram-negative, typically an opportunist, but it can cause things like pink eye and STDs and that stuff. It can cause issues in that sense as well. All right, so, but typically childhood infection most of the time. All right, so we made it to the end. So let's summarize, and again, we have the three main groups of gram-negative bacilli. We talked about the aerobic, which again are the free-living. Most of them are opportunists. Again, there's no fermentation or carbohydrates. The couple that we really talked about in here was Pseudomonas, the Legionella, which causes the pneumophilia or pneumonia in the in the Legionnaires disease, and that's spread by the amoeba. And the other one was the Bordetella pertussis. I don't have that on here, but the whooping cough is another one, the Bordetella pertussis. Then we have the intestinal bacteria, and that includes the lactose fermenters like E. coli and Klebsiella. And again, these typically get spread when they leave the area where they're not supposed to be. You have the non-lactose fermenters, which include Salmonella and Shigella, and these guys are the ones that cause problems. And again, They don't ferment lactose, and they're typically found not in humans but in other animals, and so through contamination. So improper food preparation, that's where you see these things typically. Okay, and then the non-enteric pathogens, the one that I want you to know is Yersinia pestis. And again, know the 3 types of plague. I think I always bring that up because of my research into those things: bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic plague. And then finally, Haemophilus species, again, causes a number of different types of upper respiratory infections, can also cause an STD and pink eye. But the biggest thing is, even though the one's called influenza and produces flu-like symptoms, it does not cause the flu. Okay, so if you remember that, you'll be set for the test. Okay, so we've made it through the end of the gram-negative enterics and pathogens in that sense. If you have any questions, please send me an email, leave me a note, do whatever you need to do to get your question answered. I'm happy to ask them for you and that stuff. I appreciate you watching the videos and hanging in there. We got a few more left and we're done with this semester. And I will see you next time. And thank you for watching.